This story serves as a warning about the consequences of uncontrolled jealousy and hatred. Obsession with someone or something not only destroys the lives of others, but also consumes the person themselves. It demonstrates how reckless emotions can cloud judgment and drive one to commit terrible acts. True happiness cannot be built on the destruction of another's life. Today, we delve into the tragic tale of a 27-year-old office worker named Chan, whose life took a drastic turn in 2005. She was filled with joyful anticipation as she was set to marry her beloved, whom she had been dating for 2 years, in just a few months. They had already booked the banquet hall, chosen the wedding dress, and taken their wedding photos. Their days were brimming with preparations. But on June 24, 2005, with only 4 months remaining until the wedding, something terrifying occurred. On that morning, around 8 o'clock, Chan left her home in the Sandaedong neighborhood of Seongnam, as she usually did, to head to work. She typically drove to her job. Due to the narrow streets in her area, finding a parking spot right by the house was difficult, so she parked at a nearby public parking lot. After a 10-minute walk, she reached the 5th floor where her white car was parked. At that early hour, the parking lot was nearly deserted, and only the echo of her footsteps and heels broke the silence. She unlocked her car, and just as she was opening the door, someone suddenly attacked her from behind. A sharp pain shot through her back. Chan screamed, pleading for help. "Save me! Is anyone there?" This story, steeped in horror and uncertainty, transformed dreams of a happy family life into a living nightmare. The moment the stranger grabbed Chan by the shoulder, he immediately plunged a knife into her side. Then, as if some wild rage had been unleashed within him, he continued to stab her mercilessly, a total of 28 times. Chan, bleeding profusely, collapsed to the ground. The attack was so sudden that neither she nor anyone else could have reacted in time. Blood covered not only her body but also the floor and even the white car nearby, painting everything in a vivid red hue. Tragically, she lost too much blood and perished on the spot. After ensuring she was dead, the attacker calmly took her handbag and fled. Why did such a horrific crime befall a bride-to-be standing on the threshold of her wedding? Unfortunately, there were no clues at the crime scene that immediately pointed to the killer. In 2005, surveillance cameras and dash cams were not as widespread as they are today, and evidence was sorely lacking. Of course, the police collected footage from surveillance cameras in the nearby alleys, but it didn't help identify a suspect. It was clear that the investigation would face significant challenges. In such a situation, the police began searching for witnesses. Could someone have heard screams from that garage or seen the perpetrator fleeing the scene? They put up posters, hoping someone would come forward, but no significant testimonies emerged. Meanwhile, investigators were trying to understand what could have driven the perpetrator to commit murder. The attack wasn't just a random act with a knife, it was carried out with a clear intent. After the perpetrator attacked with the knife, they took the victim's purse. At first glance, this might seem like the work of a robber-killer. However, the investigator examining the crime scene had doubts. Firstly, it was a public parking garage, where it's hard to imagine ideal conditions for a robbery murder. The victim's car was parked on the 5th floor, meaning the perpetrator would have had to climb up there, risking encounters with people along the way. It's difficult to imagine someone would take such a risk to commit robbery and murder specifically on the 5th floor. Moreover, the timing of the crime also raises questions. It occurred around 8:30 in the morning, when people are usually heading to work. At this time, the parking lot is typically bustling, with cars actively leaving the premises. The victim, Chan Shi, was killed at a moment when, surprisingly, no one else was around. Her body was discovered just 10 minutes later. From a robber's perspective, this is far from an ideal crime scene. Furthermore, the marks on Chan Shi's body indicate that this case is not straightforward. She was killed with 28 stab wounds, a clear case of overkill. In typical robbery-murder scenarios, perpetrators aim to quickly incapacitate the victim, deliver a few blows to vital organs, and escape with the loot. In this case, everything points to the crime being of a different nature. Thus, the case takes an unexpected turn. The police suspect that Chan Shi's murder might have been an act of revenge, driven by personal motives. This means the perpetrator is likely someone nearby. It could be someone close to her, someone she lost touch with long ago, or even a third party no one suspects. The police are exploring all possible angles, embarking on a full-scale investigation. Yet a challenge arises. Within Chan Shi's circle, there seems to be no one harboring such deep grudges. Why would anyone want to end the life of a 27-year-old woman who was on the brink of her wedding? At this point, the police begin to consider the wedding itself as a potential catalyst for the crime. If this crime is connected to personal relationships, could the upcoming nuptials have ignited a tragic chain of events? Consequently, suspicion immediately falls on the victim's fiancé, 30-year-old Mr. Chi. However, he has an alibi. At the time of the crime, he was already at work. This raises the question, could there be someone else with a motive to cause harm? Mr. Chi is an ordinary office worker with seemingly no enemies. At this stage, the police develop a new theory. Perhaps there's a third party linked to the impending marriage. As they widen the pool of suspects, the police uncover an unexpected lead, 30-year-old Kim Si. It turns out Kim Si is Mr. Chi's former girlfriend and his college classmate. Their relationship started as a friendship, but gradually evolved into something more serious. 2 years ago, in July 2003, they began dating with serious intentions, planning a future together. Those who had known them for a long time were convinced this couple was destined for marriage. They truly seemed perfect for each other. Naturally, Miss Kim thought so too, and openly announced their engagement to everyone. At that time, she was working as a high school teacher, and her engagement was practically common knowledge. However, Mr. Chi suddenly informed her of their breakup. Just 3 months into their romance, they parted ways. But doesn't this seem peculiar? It's known that the victim, the bride Chan, and the groom Chi began their relationship 2 years ago, and he was dating his former girlfriend from July to October 2003? Yes, this indicates that Mr. Chi was unfaithful while in a relationship. For Miss Kim, this revelation was an unexpected blow. She had been telling everyone she was preparing for a wedding, and then suddenly, everything turned upside down. She desperately tried to hold on to him, crying and pleading, but he remained cold, not even answering her calls. One day, determined to win him back at any cost, she went to his house. There, she witnessed him with Chan's victim. For her, it was a shock. The man who had been so distant with her was incredibly tender with another woman. Mrs. Kim's life turned on its head. Everything began to fall apart, and soon her existence resembled a pile of ruins. After this event, she had to leave not only her job but also her studies, as if everything she touched crumbled. The loss of the man and her job weighed heavily on her, and she couldn't fathom how her life had reached such a dead end. She often lamented, "How did I end up like this?" These cries of despair soon turned into a deep sadness, which over time transformed into rage. Gradually, Mrs. Kim began to believe that the root of all her misfortunes was the new woman, Mrs. Chan. Not her ex-boyfriend, but Chan herself. Her resentment and hatred grew like a snowball, leaving no room for rational thought. Soon, she concluded, if Chan were out of the picture, everything would go back to normal. Only without her will he be with me again, she kept telling herself. With these thoughts, Mrs. Kim sat down at her computer and wrote an email. She sent it to Mrs. Chan, declaring that the man she was seeing was, in fact, her longtime lover, and their bond could not be broken. "You must break up with him," she insisted, but her words had no effect. Chan refused to be swayed. Then Mrs. Kim decided to take extreme measures and said, "I am pregnant. It's his child." A lie, of course, but she was willing to do anything for her goal. Moreover, she started a blog under the man's name, Chi, posting motherhood diaries. That's creepy, right? Thus, because of one man, the conflict between the two women escalated to the extreme. In their emails, they use quite harsh language, engaging in verbal battles. However, the irony is that this very situation seems to have strengthened the bond between Chan and Chi. The man, going through all of this, feels that his girlfriend is steadfastly by his side, supporting him. Their love grows even stronger, and ultimately they decide to get married. When the police examined the relationships within this trio, they began to suspect that 30-year-old Kim might be involved in the murder due to the news of the upcoming wedding. She clearly had a motive. However, there was one but. On the day of the crime, Kim had an alibi, confirming she was far away from the scene of the incident. So who was guilty then? The police were completely baffled. They ran into a dead end. The motive was clear, but evidence was lacking. This raised the question, was it a contracted killing? The investigative team immediately began to trace Mr. Kim's internet search history. The findings were rather strange. It turned out that Kim regularly visited a forum called Problem Solver No. 1. This forum, as it turned out, was a sort of broker for hired killings, with the slogan, "We'll do anything you want." A shock indeed. But the police suspected that this wasn't the end of it, and they decided to check his email. And indeed, details of a murder for hire were found. The email stated, "Upon agreement to undertake the task, an advance payment of 9 million won, with an additional payment of 3 million won upon success." Of course, it didn't specify what the order was about, but the context made it clear. Moreover, Kim had sent the advance payment of 9 million won through the mail. Listening to this, you might be thinking, is such a thing possible? Do forums for contract killings actually exist? The incident took place in 2005. Back in those days, typing contract killing into an internet search engine would bring up a plethora of websites and forums. Of course, most of them were scams aimed at extorting money. However, some did indeed offer services related to crimes like kidnapping and murder for a fee. This became a serious social issue of the time. Now let's return to our case. The next task was to arrest the owner of the notorious forum Number 1 Fixer, a 33-year-old man named Hyun. The police traced the IP address he used and discovered that Hyun frequently accessed the internet from one of the PC cafes in Incheon. Officers set up a stakeout near this cafe, but a problem arose. A day passed, then another, but Hyun never showed up. Concerns began to grow. What if he had already fled? This was entirely possible, especially considering that Chang was already deceased. If Hyun managed to escape, the case might remain unsolved. Despite this, the detectives did not lose hope and continued their vigil. Finally, after several days, a man matching the description walked into the cafe. It was him. 40 days after the investigation began, on August 8, 2005, the police finally arrested Hyun. But the story didn't end there. Accused of murder, Hyun suddenly claimed he didn't know who Chang was. He staunchly denied everything. He adamantly denied any involvement in the crime. But it's just incredible. When the police decided to check his belongings and asked him to empty his pockets, out fell a photograph. And it was a photograph of the victim, Mr. Chang. Moreover, on the back, contact details were scribbled down. The police questioned, "You claim not to know this person, so why are you carrying around his photo and contact information? It's absurd." Even for the officers, it was such an obvious lie that they couldn't believe their ears. Eventually, after prolonged interrogations, Mr. Hyun confessed to everything. The events unfolded 2 weeks prior, on June 10th. Driven by jealousy, Mr. Kim reached out to Mr. Hyun through the Fixer No. 1-inch cafe. He asked the manager to arrange a contract killing. Mr. Hyun liked to present himself as a genuine fixer, but in reality, he was more of a con artist. He took on all sorts of requests, from those wanting to recover stolen money to those asking him to steal exam papers for civil service tests. Even those seeking revenge turned to him. Mr. Hyun always operated the same way. "Of course, I'll do whatever you want," he would say, demanding an advance payment. And then he would simply pocket the money and vanish. The amount he swindled reached an impressive 62 million won. Upon receiving the money, he usually just disappeared. He knew the client couldn't go to the police. But why did he participate in the murder this time? The reason was that during the discussion, he heard Kim's story. Suddenly, he was deeply moved by it. After all, he too had once been betrayed by a woman he loved. It happened 3 years ago when his live-in girlfriend started an affair with his own brother. In one fell swoop, he lost both his girlfriend and his brother. The betrayal filled him with a terrible disgust. The loss was so great that he couldn't find peace for a long time. After that, he developed a pathological aversion to betrayal in relationships between men and women. And then he heard Kim's story about his fiancée cheating on him. He saw in this a reflection of his own situation. He had received an advance from Kim, along with information about Chang. They told him where she lived, what her daily routine was like, and he began to closely monitor her to find the perfect moment for the murder. From time to time, he sent Kim emails with updates on the situation. These emails were preserved. For instance, imagine someone lying in wait outside Miss Chang's home, but at some point losing sight of her. Soon, however, he discovered where she most frequently parked. All these details were carefully thought out. On the day of the crime, June 24th, the perpetrator hid on the 5th floor of the parking garage, waiting for his victim from the early morning. He had already calculated his escape route in advance. Around 8:30, Miss Chang appeared in the parking lot and headed to her car. The moment she opened the door, Mr. Hyun, armed and ready, attacked her. Chang screamed in pain and terror. Hyun, struck by surprise and the loud cries of his victim, feared he would be caught. In a panic, he began stabbing wildly, ultimately striking her 8 times. Miss Chang fell, bleeding profusely. But Hyun, despite this, attempted to disguise the crime as a robbery murder, taking her purse and fleeing the scene. This meticulously planned act made the police wonder, was this really his first murder? Could he have done this before? As they initiated the investigation with the possibility of other crimes in mind, the police soon discovered that Hyun had already been involved in another contract killing. And this occurred after Miss Chang's murder. Although only 40 days passed between Chang's murder and his arrest, he managed to kill once more. Perhaps after the first murder, he felt a surge of confidence, thinking it brought money and he wouldn't be caught. Could it be that I have a talent for killing? Maybe I should try it again? That's exactly how it all began. The second murder took place on July 22, 2005. This time, he had another accomplice who helped free his friend, Mr. Hong. Together, they set off to the Manwol Mountain area in Bupyeong, Incheon. Their target was a 39-year-old man known as Mr. A. They had previously contacted Mr. A through an internet chat, using his accomplice to lure him to Manwol Mountain. There, alongside his accomplice friend, they strangled him to death. Mr. A's body was left by Hyeon near a substation on the road in the Hwajong area. Once the deed was done, Hyeon and his friend each received 2,250,000 won. This money instilled a sense of confidence in him, and he continued his spree of crimes. Soon enough, Hyeon was arrested and confessed to everything, simultaneously exposing Mr. Kim, who had hired him for the murder. However, Kim was audacious. He continued to plead his innocence. Yes, he admitted to hiring them, but he claimed he never asked for killing. "I only asked them to teach him a lesson or scare him a bit," Kim insisted. "Who could have thought it would end in murder?" he justified. Shouts pierced the air, but even this lie quickly unraveled when it was revealed that Mr. Kim had already attempted to commission a murder through another company before approaching Mr. Hyeon. This was a month prior to the incident. He had requested the job and transferred a down payment of 10 million won into their account. Yet again, he only lost money, falling victim to a scam. All the traces of this transaction were preserved in the bank statements. Just imagine, even today, 10 million won is a significant amount, and in 2005 it was an enormous sum. Despite such a loss, he persistently sought ways to kill Mr. Chang, soliciting another murder. It seems unfathomable, as if he had completely abandoned his life. Be that as it may, the legal proceedings concerning this case have concluded. Mr. Hyun, the man who directly carried out the murder, was sentenced to life imprisonment, while Mr. Kim, the mastermind behind the plot, received a 25-year prison sentence. However, believing his punishment to be excessively harsh, Mr. Kim filed an appeal. The Supreme Court sided with him, ultimately reducing his sentence to 15 years. As of now, he is a free man, and his current whereabouts remain unknown. It seems that both Kim and Hyun harbored the belief that human life could be bought and sold, catering to their darkest desires. Without hesitation, they dealt in the lives of others for money. Blinded by envy, they destroyed their own destinies. It was a cruel and merciless tragedy, the murder of a bride in a parking lot in Seongnam. And now the second story, which is just as impactful. I'm looking forward to hearing what you think about the first story in the comments. I'll make sure to read every response. In the 1950s, the city of Kasukabe saw the opening of the Nansai Hospital, initially established as a facility for the treatment of tuberculosis patients. However, behind the facade of a medical institution lurked a true nightmare that would haunt those unfortunate enough to undergo treatment there. In 1990, the hospital was renamed in honor of its chief physician, Asakura, and soon rumors about its operations began to circulate. From this point, it expanded into a full-scale facility, boasting 12 general and 230 psychiatric wards. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary hospital. Yet how did it transform into something so horrific that it remained etched in memory like a scene from a horror film? In April 2001, a former nurse who had worked at Asakura Hospital made a shocking revelation. She claimed that around 40 patients undergoing treatment had died under suspicious circumstances. The nurse confessed that even she did not understand how or why this had happened, and she insisted on the necessity of uncovering the truth. As a result, authorities launched a thorough investigation into the hospital's activities, which lasted nearly a year. Gradually, horrifying facts began to emerge, with the first and most glaring being the conditions in which the patients were kept. At Asakura Hospital, most patients lived literally bound hand and foot. This was not limited to psychiatric ward patients. Many were tied by their wrists, ankles, and even shoulders. Some patients were strapped by the waist with belts affixed to the wall, thus immobilized to their beds. Without assistance, they could not move anywhere. Even considering it was a psychiatric facility, it seemed they were treated as beings beneath human dignity. No exceptions were made even during sleep. Because they were restrained, moving was difficult, making restful sleep impossible. Of course, psychiatric hospitals sometimes employ physical restraints to prevent potential incidents related to a patient's severe condition. However, according to Asakura Hospital's representatives, nearly all patients were subjected to such measures regardless of their condition. This was particularly true for new patients. They were tightly bound in more than 7 places and left in their rooms. When patients became confused, they were told something like, "This is kind of our hospital policy, a ritual?" Some could not withstand this suffocating feeling and attempted to free themselves from their bonds. But if they were caught, the hospital intensified the restraints. Listening to these accounts, One gets the impression that this was less of a hospital and more of a detention camp. But this was only the beginning of the immoral acts taking place within this institution. Even from a standpoint of basic common sense, it's clear that in a hospital where surgeries are performed, hygiene should be a top priority. However, at Asakura Hospital, not only was there a blatant disregard for cleanliness in the operating rooms, but they also lacked the necessary medical instruments. In one of the so-called operating rooms, which was improperly equipped, major surgeries such as colon or breast cancer removals were conducted right in an ordinary ward. It sounds unbelievable, but that's exactly how it was. Testimonies indicate that at that time, even the most basic partitions or curtains were not installed. Under these appalling conditions, surgeries were performed on 3 cancer patients who never recovered and passed away. Naturally, the authorities in Saitama couldn't have been unaware of these occurrences. Yet, because the patients' conditions were already poor, they claimed it was impossible to definitively blame the surgeries for their deaths and sided with the hospital. As a result, the hospital was merely issued a warning not to conduct operations under such conditions in the future. One would think this was obvious, wouldn't they? Despite the string of deaths, Asakura Hospital avoided any legal repercussions. Moreover, although the hospital had a general ward, for some inexplicable reason, it was not accessible to residents of Saitama Prefecture. Patients came in for surgery or treatment, and everything was conducted without their relatives' consent, only with their personal consent, so no one outside knew what was truly happening inside. So, are you ready to learn about the worst atrocities of this hospital? Asakura Hospital was actively using a treatment method known as intravenous hyperalimentation therapy, which is essentially an intravenous injection. This medical procedure was intended for patients who couldn't eat normally and involved administering high-calorie nutrients directly into the vein. However, the issue was that at Asakura Hospital, this therapy was being applied even to those patients who were perfectly capable of eating normally. This was illegal. Nurses were forbidden from even noting in patient records that they had an appetite. Most patients in this ill-fated medical facility were diagnosed with anorexia, after which they were fed not with food but with injections. The problem is that if a normal person is constantly given intravenous injections, it disrupts their nutrition and bodily balance. This, in turn, leads to impaired kidney function. If such a condition is maintained, the body gradually loses its functions, immunity decreases, and the risk of infections rises rapidly. When it comes to places like Asakura Hospital, where hygiene seemed a foreign concept, the risk of infection multiplied exponentially. The hospital was known for literally tying patients to their beds and daily pumping them with tranquilizers and intravenous injections in staggering amounts. There were even accounts that nurses were tasked with randomly selecting which patient would receive intravenous hyperalimentation first, almost as if by the flip of a coin. It felt as if the patients weren't seen as human beings. Some nurses, appalled by such practices, voiced their concerns, arguing that this was no way to operate. Their reward? Only one: termination. The hospital retained only those staff who would unconditionally follow the director's orders. This begs the question, why was such an inhumane operation masquerading under the guise of a hospital? The answer is simple: money. The administration was more interested in generating revenue from other sources than actually treating patients and profiting from their recovery. Patients were indiscriminately given IV drips, leading to deteriorated kidney function, after which medications and antibiotics were procured for their treatment. These expenses were then submitted to the government as treatment compensation. In plain terms, to secure subsidies and medical allowances, the patient numbers were artificially inflated and maintained in that state. Typically, people go to a hospital to survive. However, this hospital recorded 40 mysterious patient deaths. Why then didn't families raise an outcry? The truth is, what happened in the hospital remained hidden until a former nurse decided to speak out. Over 90% of Asakura Hospital's patients suffered from dementia, and the majority were elderly. Of these, 40% were homeless or on basic social welfare. To avoid potential scandals, the hospital deliberately accepted those without family or those who were never visited. Patients had no means to complain about unfair treatment. They simply lacked the opportunity. One shocking revelation described an elderly patient who, until her last breath, cried out in desperation, "Food! Food!" tormented by hunger. Some patients realized something was amiss and tried to explain that they were not mentally ill, pleading for their release, but to the hospital, they were merely sources of income. For the sake of profit, the hospital wouldn't let them go. Everything changed in 2001 when a former nurse decided to come forward with the truth. This revelation marked the beginning of a series of exposés from employees and numerous testimonies. They turned to the Saitama Insurance Company with accusations against the hospital, and soon inspections and investigations began. The whole truth about Asakura Hospital became known throughout Japan. Eventually, it became the first hospital in the country to receive an order to limit patient intake, and in July 2001, it was permanently closed. But this didn't mean that all problems were resolved. Legal accountability was still needed. And what about the 40 mysterious deaths? The issue was that finding evidence on how exactly these 40 individuals died proved nearly impossible. Furthermore, none of the relatives of the deceased raised this issue. As a result, the exact causes of these people's deaths were never established, and the case was forgotten. Did the hospital director at least receive his deserved punishment? The photograph shows him. At the time, the director of Asakura Hospital. He inherited the institution from his father, the hospital's founder. To him, patients were merely sources of income, and he eventually fell under investigation. However, due to the lack of evidence related to murder, he managed to evade punishment. The hospital closed, but the official reason was excessive treatment of patients and the receipt of unwarranted compensation. When asked to explain the fatal incidents, he defended himself by claiming that although he ordered emergency surgeries, the patients' conditions were extremely critical. To accusations of illegally restraining patients, he firmly responded that such actions never occurred. Ultimately, the director was punished only for falsifying medical records. In July 2001, his registration as a medical practitioner was revoked. But this was not the end of the story. Although his registration was annulled, his medical license remained intact, allowing him to practice cosmetic and aesthetic medicine in Japan. Moreover, 5 years later, he could open a medical practice again. At one point, rumors circulated that he was working as a pediatrician in one of Japan's hospitals, but his current whereabouts are unknown. The abandoned Asakura Hospital stood empty for a long time, casting an eerie atmosphere. When the building was hastily shuttered, it left behind the eerie remnants of its past, wheelchairs and mattresses once used by the patients. In South Korea, the Kwancheom Hospital gained notoriety as a grim place that captured public fascination for decades. The hospital was shrouded in sinister rumors, drawing those eager to witness the supernatural. Among the most chilling tales was the one about the basement, from which muffled thuds were said to emanate constantly. It was whispered that these were the sounds of a deceased patient's soul, bound and relentlessly banging their head against the wall in a desperate bid for freedom. A terrifying legend that sent shivers down the spine. By 2017, the demolition of the hospital had begun, and access for the general public was restricted. Now, where the hospital once stood, there remains only a vacant lot encircled by barbed wire. A hospital is fundamentally an institution designed to protect and care for human life, a truth we seldom question. Yet at its core, a hospital is a business that must turn a profit. Hence, when a doctor suggests an X-ray or a CT scan, many of us ponder whether it's merely a ploy to boost revenue. However, when a hospital starts viewing each patient as a mere profit source and deliberately prolongs their suffering to prevent them from crossing over to the other side, it evokes not only sadness, but a profound sense of injustice. Patients left languishing in hospital beds to satisfy someone's greed, and Director Asakura, possibly still donning a white coat and seeing patients. Such thoughts send a chill racing down one's spine.